Hey there! Welcome back to Cooking with AJMR. I am your host, Chef AJMR, and in today's video, I'm going to be showing you guys how to cook the fourth dish of my senior project, which is arepas with cheese, onions, and eggs. Seeing as arepas or corn flour cakes are one of the more popular breakfast items in the Colombian culture, they can be accompanied with a multitude of delicious ingredients, including the ones that I'm going to be using in this video. Additionally, some popular drinks that go with arepas in the morning range from a regular Colombian coffee to even a warm chocolate drink to get your day started. Alright, with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and move on to the ingredients section of this cooking tutorial video. Okay, so the necessary ingredients that I'm going to be using for this cooking tutorial video are as follows. We first have some corn flour mix, some eggs, any choice of cheese that you would like to use, diced tomatoes and onions, vegetable oil, butter, and some salt. You will also need 2 cups of hot water, but I'll get to that in a little bit. Now, if you guys remember, near the end of the last video, I mentioned how I was going to include chorizo as one of the main ingredients, which is basically sausage.
Flashback.
For our next cooking session, I will show you guys how to make arepas with eggs, cheese, and chorizo.
End of flashback.
After talking with my mentor, we decided to keep the cooking video more simple, so we removed the ingredient in its entirety. Alright, now that I've listed out all the ingredients that I'm going to be using for this cooking tutorial video, we can now move on to the first step of making our arepas with cheese, eggs, and onions. Okay, so this first step is super easy. All we're going to do is pour our pieces of diced tomatoes and diced onions into this little pot right here on the stove. And the reason why this step is so easy is because we're actually going to leave these pieces of tomatoes and diced onions sitting here on the stove for a little bit while we go work on the actual arepas that we'll need. And if there's any tomato pieces or onion pieces left in these little containers, don't forget to always scoop them out as well. And once you're done taking out any extra pieces of tomatoes or onions that were left in the containers, we can now go ahead and move on to the next step of the cooking tutorial video. Okay, so the second step of our cooking tutorial video is actually taking a measuring cup here and grabbing our corn flour mix and pouring exactly 1 cup of corn flour. So around this little indicator mark right there. So we're not going to pour too much really quickly because then we might pour too much. So I'm just going to pour just a little bit until I feel like we're at the 1 cup mark. And as you can see, we're still very far off. So let's go ahead and keep pouring some more. And that should be good enough. As you guys can see right there, it's basically 1 cup corn flour mix. Once we have our exactly 1 cup of corn flour mix, we're going to grab a bigger bowl such as this one and just pour it into this big bowl. And then we are going to start adding the other ingredients as well, which is the vegetable oil and some salt to the contents in this bowl. But before we do that, let's go ahead and clean out this little cup measure and put exactly 2 cups of hot water into this measuring cup, as I stated previously. So once again, we will need at least 2 cups of hot water, which will allow us to make the form of the arepas more easily, seeing as with clay, it's kind of hard to mold it when it's really hard, so you'll need water to make the structure of the clay, or in this case, the corn flour mix, to be more soft, but not too soft, not too hard either, so that we can easily mold the shape of the arepas. Now that our measuring cup is clean, we're just going to turn on the water and wait for it to get hot. So you can just wait a little bit while it starts to heat up. Okay, so now that it's been around, I'd say maybe a minute, the water has now heated up. So now we can go ahead and take our measuring cup and start filling it up until it reaches the 2-cup mark. Somewhere around there. Yep, should be good 2 cups of hot water right there. And once we have the 2 cups of hot water, we'll just put it aside for now, and we will go back to the big bowl full of corn flour mix and add the other ingredients, which once again is the vegetable oil and the salt. Okay, so now that we have finished pouring the hot water, we're going to grab the salt and pour just barely a spoonful. I'd say somewhere around this much, maybe a little bit more. And then once you have the salt ready, we're just going to pour it on top of the corn flour mix, and then we can close the salt. Then we're going to take our vegetable oil and start pouring inside as such, like that, somewhere around there. And then we will take our hot water and then start pouring a little bit. But before you guys start pouring the water, do not pour the entire thing all at once. We're going to pour the hot water at variable times, seeing as we don't want the corn flour mix to be too wet, and then it will be more harder to make the structure of the arepas later. So we're just going to pour a little bit as such, maybe a little bit more. And then once you have the corn flour mix wet, you can either do this with or without gloves. I think just to be safe, I'm going to do it with gloves as such. And as you can see, it's starting to get a little bit dry, so we're going to add a little bit more water. Like that. And I'm going to make sure that every piece of corn flour mix has been covered in water. And as you can see, some pieces are still a little bit dry. So let's go ahead and start adding a little bit more hot water, making sure that every part once again is covered. And then you're just going to mash the corn flour like such. Once again, making sure that each part is covered and no place is left behind. Any parts that are on the outskirts of the bowl, and scoop it up like that using this specific hand movement and start crushing up the corn flour like this. And once you start seeing the flour, the corn flour mix start to dry up a little bit, that's your little notification to start adding just a tad bit more hot water. So we're going to do so. And usually you don't have to use up all of the hot water, but it is recommended that you at least have 2 cups of hot water. And you also want to press down really hard and make sure that every place has been meshed down, because eventually if you don't press down really hard on every piece of corn flour in this bowl when you're using the griddle in a next step later in the video, you will notice that some parts of the corn flour are harder than others, seeing as probably some areas were left untouched or didn't have enough water. Now, when you guys are actually doing this step of mixing the corn flour mix, if you feel like it is too soft and you don't think you'll be able to make the corn flour balls, you can add just a little bit more of corn flour mix to see if it evens it out and to see if it will make it easier to make the corn flour balls when we get to that step in a little bit. Okay, so as you guys can see, the corn flour mix has now been stirred up and is now in a big group or a hunch all together. And we also have just a little bit more of hot water, and you can use up until just like a little bit is left if you feel like it is too dry. But as of right now, I feel like everything is good. It's not too hard, it's not too soft. So if you want, you can either pour just a little bit if you feel like it's still too hard or you can just get rid of the hot water now. And once we have done that, we can start with the next step of our cooking tutorial video. Now that we have the corn flour mix ready to be made into circular little balls, and then we'll put them on the griddle. Okay, so with this amount of corn flour mix, you should be able to make at least 3 arepas. And before we get started with the process, I do want to mention that this is just an optional tip. If you find it hard to actually make these circular corn flour balls, so all you need is a little bit of vegetable oil, and you just put a little bit on your fingers, whether you do this gloved or ungloved, and then you'll just grab just a little bit of the corn flour mix and start molding it into a circular ball. And if you feel like it's too small, then you can start grabbing a little bit more. Circular. What I like to do is just mold the sides first and then switch over to the other hand and see if that helps. Once you have your first arepa flattened or in a circular ball, we will then move over to the griddle and place it there, and we will start spreading out the arepa so that it can start frying or cooking while it's on there. So let's just go ahead and move over to the griddle. Okay guys, so as you can see, we have now placed the first arepa on the griddle, and what we're going to do next is actually spread out the arepa so we can make it thinner but also larger at the same time, seeing as it's still kind of chunky. So we need to spread out the arepa on all sides to make it once again thinner but larger. And then once I'm finished with this, I'm going to repeat the process of making 2 other corn flour balls and then putting them on the griddle and spreading them out. Okay guys, so as you can see, I now have all 3 arepas ready on the griddle, and I won't lie, I did need help from my mom with making the arepas. I tried to follow my mentor's steps of trying to make circular balls and then putting them on the griddle, but it was still kind of hard for me, and it's definitely the most difficult part, at least for me, making this dish. But all in all, we still have the arepas on the griddle. I flattened them out as much as I could, and yeah, once you have them on the griddle cooking for some time, you should start checking if one side of the arepas for all 3 are already done, and then you can flip it over, such as for this one on the far end, which was the very first one. You can just pick it up like this and then quickly flip it over as such, and then all you have to do is basically just wait for all sides of the arepas to be cooked. And then, yeah, we'll move on to the next step once all 3 arepas are ready. Another thing I actually want to add is that whenever you guys are spreading out the arepas on the griddle, I do recommend to just use your bare hands, but be very careful not to burn yourself, because using the gloves while you're trying to flatten it out kind of makes it harder to unstick yourself from the arepas, seeing as the gloves are already covered in corn flour mix. So if you're trying to press down, it's going to be easier for the arepas to stick to the gloves compared to your hands. So yeah, just keep that in mind for whenever you're making this. Okay, so now that all the 3 arepas have been flipped on both sides and have now been cooked on both sides, we can now turn down the heat on the griddle by just a little bit and also wait around 3 to 5 minutes, and then our arepas will be ready. Once they are ready, we can put them on a plate and then move on to the next step of our cooking tutorial video. Okay, so now that it's been around 3 minutes, we can go ahead and turn off the griddle completely, and then take the 3 arepas that are now ready, cooked on both sides, put them on a plate, and move on to the next and final step of this cooking tutorial video. Okay, so now that we are on our final step of this cooking tutorial video, we have now returned to the diced tomatoes and diced onions as well. What we're first going to do is turn on the stove to the second highest temperature that we can, and then we're going to use this little stirring tool to spread out all the pieces of diced tomatoes and onions, seeing as they were all bunched together. So let's just spread them out a little bit. And once we have done that, we can then add a little bit more of vegetable oil into the actual pot. We're just going to add just a little bit. We're going to do a little circular motion 2 times. So that should be good enough. And then we can start stirring once again. And then we're just going to wait for the contents within the pot to start cooking a little bit since it's on the stove. And then once it starts steaming up a little bit, after around 5 minutes, we're going to then add the eggs and then also tone down the temperature of the stove just a little bit. Okay, so as you guys can see, the diced tomatoes and diced onions inside the pot with the vegetable oil are starting to cook very quickly, seeing as once again we've put the stove to the second highest temperature. So now we can actually turn down the temperature, and then once we have done that and stirred the pot just a little bit more, we can start to crack the eggs and actually pour contents in the egg into the pot here with the diced onions and the diced tomatoes. So once again, we're just going to crack the eggs just a little bit so that we can crack it open as such. And then we're going to repeat this same process once again with the other 2 eggs, seeing as we're going to be using 3 for this cooking tutorial video. But now with all 3 eggs inside, we can start stirring all the contents. Alright guys, so now as you can see, after 2 to 3 minutes of stirring the eggs after being added to the contents already in the pot, which was the diced onions and diced tomatoes with the vegetable oil inside, you can also add a little bit of salt before we take it off the stove. You can add just a little bit. Like that. But once your eggs basically look scrambled, then you can take it off the stove, and yeah, your eggs with tomatoes and onions should be good now once you have finished stirring after adding all the salt. Okay, so now that we have finished making the 3 arepas as well as the eggs with diced onions and tomatoes, we can now go ahead and perform 2 optional steps, which is adding some cheese of any choice. This is actually a homemade cheese that my grandma likes to make, so we'll just leave it right there, as well as adding butter, because although it's not commonly used, it is still delicious, at least in my opinion, to add a little bit of butter on all the arepas, seeing as they're very delicious. Alright, it looks like we have successfully completed yet another cooking tutorial video, where we have ended up with some delicious arepas that are accompanied with cheese and scrambled eggs that are mixed with diced tomatoes and some white onions. Once again, you guys can use whichever ingredients that you want, seeing as you don't have to follow my tutorial exactly. But this is a more traditional version of what a Colombian breakfast would look like. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this cooking tutorial video. Please let me know down in the comments if anyone watching is willing to try to cook this very same dish using the steps that I provided. For our next and final cooking session, I will show you guys how to cook arroz con pollo, which directly translates to rice with chicken. Now that might seem bland at first, but trust me, it looks and tastes better than you think. Well anyways, I also want to thank you guys for being patient with me, waiting for this 4th cooking tutorial video, seeing as I was planning on making it and releasing it toward the end of January, but I did get sidetracked a little bit with school, and I definitely didn't use my time wisely. But yeah, nonetheless, thank you guys once again for watching the video. The next cooking tutorial video should release either end of February, so this month, or maybe beginning of March, hopefully. But with all that being said, I hope you guys have a great day. Thank you once again for all the support and for watching the video, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.